Hi everybody, it's Kirsty. In today's video, I want to talk about the fear of getting recovery wrong and staying stuck. But before I go into that, I'd like to ask, please do subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below in order to stay up to date with new videos as they're released. So with this particular fear, I think it's quite a common one that some of us can kind of take on as we work further into our recovery journey. Because obviously when OCD is at its worst, and obviously we all know how horrible that can feel in the moment, I think it can leave a lasting effect on us that makes us almost feel a little bit traumatized by the experience, when we don't actually know what's happening with OCD. We don't know how OCD works. We don't know what's happening to us. We feel completely out of control. We don't know that, we don't know that OCD makes us doubt everything. So we feel like, our feared scenario is all real. And we know how difficult life can be as we sort of try and navigate our way around it with OCD, even when OCD is not at its worst. So there's naturally going to be a part of us that fears not being able to actually recover. There's a part of us that fears not getting better at all. In addition to the original fear that would have maybe been fueling the fear cycle in first place, like for example, depending on what, maybe what theme or themes it was that had us kind of becoming quite chronic with our OCD. With that being the original fear, whether that's, losing your partner or snapping and acting out and becoming a mass murderer, or whether that's, whether it's kind of fear of not knowing your own sexuality, of actually not realizing that you want to be a different gender, or whether it's POCD or contamination, whatever it is, there's that original fear, but then on top of that adds the fear of not being able to get better from OCD. So when we start to develop this fear, and I think it can, it can rear its head at any point in the recovery journey, and it can sort of pop up at various different points. But when we start to experience this fear, it might be that we start to actually get stuck on the thoughts about not recovering, and we start to get stuck on whether we're doing recovery right. So I want to give some examples of how that might look in regards to thoughts we might be experiencing, compulsions that we might be, taking part in. And then I want to offer some tips in terms of how we can work through this particular fear. And it's important that we do work through this fear, because although we do want to recover, we want it to be a preference, not a demand. And we don't want to be thinking it would be absolutely awfully, terribly, end of the world, couldn't stand it, bad if we don't recover. Because obviously that can hold us back if we're then sort of obsessing. And if you're holding on to the fear of not being able to recover, it can manifest not only in ways where you're obsessing over how you're doing things right, but your original theme can still continue going because you're afraid of this kind of the way it makes you feel. Even if you've worked on your irrational beliefs around your original fear. So for example, my OCD got chronic when it latched onto relationship OCD. So even once I'd started to really, really tackle, seriously in depth tackle the fears surrounding ROCD, I was still having, ROCD symptoms, because I was terrified of ROCD itself and not getting better from it. So it's definitely something I've recovered. It's definitely something I've experienced. But also I found myself then ruminating over, whether I'm doing recovery right. So in terms of compulsions, around the fear of not doing recovery right, it could be compulsive research, which is definitely something I'm guilty of, as I've spoken about in many other videos. My Kindle library for a while was pages and pages of OCD books. So firstly, it can be compulsive research, whether that's continuous reading of books, always searching for the next thing about getting better, or whether that's Googling or constantly asking questions about how you're doing recovery as well. That can be another one. So it might be with your whether you're working with an OCD coach, or whether you're working with a therapist, psychiatrist, or whatever it might be. It would be constantly asking questions. So no matter what they've said to you, your response is, okay, but then how do I respond to the thoughts? Or, okay, but how do I know if I'm doing it right? How do I need to feel? What's the exact feeling I need to feel? So it's constantly never feeling satisfied with what they're telling you because you want to get it right, because you're so scared of getting it wrong, basically. It can also look like excessive note taking. So this is I've done a video about this, excessive note taking and planning, etc. Excessive note taking about recovery. It can be excessive amounts of time spent on the cognitive work that you need to be doing for recovery. So it might be you might be excessively spending more time than necessary examining cognitive distortions, or it might be more time than necessary disputing irrational beliefs. So if you're working on kind of trying to be more rational and using that to bring your fears down, like we talk about on this channel, it might be that rather than spending perhaps the recommended half an hour a day, you're spending 3 hours a day. Or in fact, it may be that the minute you have a thought come in, you jump all over it, trying to be rational about it, or you jump on that thought straight away saying, yeah, it's real, basically trying to force acceptance. So there's many, many ways that we can find ourselves doing kind of compulsive things because we're terrified of not getting recovery right, but actually, because they become compulsive because they're driven from a place of fear, looking for relief, they end up fueling the cycle. So, you're giving it, more attention than it deserves to be given. So like when you're jumping all over these thoughts, you're given the thought, you're shining the light on the thought. So obviously you're responding to them more than you should be. Even if you are trying to say, it's real, I'm going to accept it, you're trying to force acceptance. And by forcing acceptance, you're not accepting. Another thing that one might find themselves doing is end up delaying doing their exposures because they're desperately trying to have exactly the right circumstance for doing the exposure. The exposure has to be exactly right, and they might be overanalyzing. Am I anxious enough? Oh, I'm not doing the exposure right because I'm not anxious enough. Or, so you end up kind of delaying it and overthinking it, or you might end up wanting to do they're desperately seeking the next exposure. So I believe there's a video on this channel about, searching for the next just right exposure. I think it was Hannah who made that video. And that's something we can find ourselves doing because, again, we're desperate to get on with these exposures because maybe we've experienced a bit of relief from our symptoms. So then we want more relief. So then we're scrambling around trying to find the right exposure then to get us further along. So as you can see, there's so many ways that we can, exhibit the fear of not getting recovery right. There's so many ways that we can be trying to force recovery, force acceptance. And unfortunately, that is still a resistance. By doing that, you're putting up an active resistance to the experience of having OCD itself. And the idea of acceptance is that it's a non-doing, it's a non-action, it's not holding up resistance. Resistance is action, and it takes energy, and all of these things, it's all resisting the symptoms and having OCD itself. And annoyingly, a huge part of OCD recovery is the acceptance of having OCD itself. It's changing our perspective on OCD. And although we want to, recover standard, naturally, why wouldn't we? In the meantime, we do still have to put up with having OCD because it's while we believe it's terrible, it's intolerable, I must get rid of it, it ain't going anywhere, annoyingly. So a big part of OCD recovery is our perspective on having OCD itself. And when we work on this perspective and learn to be more accepting of OCD itself, we can bring the fear down of OCD, the fear of fear. We can bring this down and, the fear of not recovering, etc. And when we bring the fear of getting recovery wrong down, and we can accept a bit of uncertainty, then we can actually focus on recovery again. Because actually, while we're fearing it and we're desperately scrambling around trying to get it right, we're holding ourselves back from it, because it's all coming from a place of fear and resistance. As I said, the mental work is still going on. We're obsessing over OCD. We're obsessed with trying to get rid of OCD. Then we might be ruminating about how we can make sure we're getting recovery right. How can I make sure for certain I'm responding to the thoughts correctly? How can I make sure that I don't forget everything that I'm learning on my recovery journey? How can I make sure everything's documented? Do I journal it down? All of this is expending so much effort, and OCD recovery is enough effort as it is without over analyzing it and trying way too hard. Obviously we have to put in a lot of effort, and it is trying hard, but if we're that effort's coming from a place of like horror, like I have to get rid of it, then if it's from a place of fear, then it's seeking to rid ourselves of it. OCD knows that we're seeking to rid ourselves of it, and it bounces back. It's like, we might find when, say if we're like getting ready to go on vacation or holiday or something, and we desperately want rid of OCD before the holiday. OCD knows that. OCD knows that you're checking for it. OCD knows that you're looking for it being there. So it will be coming along with you. So speaking about all of this reminds me, so this was definitely, as I said, this is a fear I had. And all of the compulsions that I've listed, that was me, very much so. I remember having moments where, like, pacing around my flat, I'd been working, I'd been sort of doing reasonably well on my recovery. I'd had some of my anxiety had come down, but the thoughts are bouncing around. How do I respond to this thought? Oh my God. And then another one comes up, and it was I was like caught on a loop of ruminating over how to respond and what I should be doing, and should I be saying it's real. So it reminds me of that, and it wasn't pleasant. So I want to talk about how we can work through this fear. And as I said, so firstly, it's a big perspective change. So if we look at OCD, and there are videos about this, I mean, there's a playlist on this channel about perspective, because this is huge. When we look at having OCD and we think it's awful, it can help us to look at what we can be grateful for, because gratitude is a big thing in perspective change. So in this day and age, so 2021, OCD sufferers have access to YouTube channels such as this. Now, this YouTube channel wasn't around 4 years ago when I was at my worst. I wish it had been. But it's here now. We have Facebook page, we have a Facebook support group for OCD recovery. We have an Instagram page, and there's multiple other support groups, social media, run by other people that can give lots of education. We can, there's a whole big community. There's communities dedicated to specific fears and themes even. There's this whole world of education at our fingertips now that we didn't have, 10 years ago, definitely not 20 years ago, and 100 years ago, where, people didn't have computers. There would be nothing. 200 years ago, people may have been burnt at the stake for experience, if they were to confess some of the things that the symptoms and thoughts that they were experiencing. So when you think of it like that, and sort of, you can feel a bit of gratitude for the support and education that we have now. It is hard to seek treatment for OCD. You can find yourself on long waiting lists, and it doesn't come cheap, and it's not easy to find OCD specialists. No. So that's something that could help drive, that's something that obviously might drive the fear. However, what we do have is, we have lots of literature around OCD. There's been, research now. We have, like I say, access to social media. We can learn a lot about it. We can speak to other sufferers. We can read articles by experts online. So we can feel grateful, firstly, for having OCD in this day and age where we have access to these things. Another thing that I feel that it's useful to kind of see is that you can feel more than one emotion at once. So OCD obviously makes us feel very anxious, but you can feel anxious and still feel joy at the same time. Trust me, you can. And you can feel sadness and still feel joy at the same time. After people have lost someone that they love, they can feel grief, but they can still be doing, they can still get joy each day out of, from, for example, their children. Their children don't just stop giving them joy because they're grieving. So you can feel more than one emotion at once. So yes, you might feel anxious. Yes, you might feel down about your OCD, but that doesn't mean that you can't get snippets of enjoyment out of your day. And in the moment when it's at its worst, yeah, that's, it's hard to get a lot of enjoyment. But once you've started learning about OCD and you've started educating yourself, you can't unlearn these things. You can't go back to that very square one point. When you have your dips, when you have like setbacks and things, you feel like you're at square one potentially. Yes, but you're not at square one because you like I say, you're not the same person you were back then. You know things, even if you doubt it, you know it. So, you're not necessarily going to be going back to square one, and you can still find moments in your day that aren't as bad. Even if it's just 1 minute, there will still be those moments. Another thing that helps with perspective is considering the fact that, as I said, we have access to all these things and we can recover from OCD. There are people who have, terminal illnesses that they can't recover from, that will continue getting worse until that person passes away. Now, if that person, and don't get me wrong, not everyone could accept that, and, that's that not everyone necessarily would be able to accept. But if there are some people who can accept having terminal illnesses, why can't we accept having OCD? Why can't we accept it and see that it's bloody unpleasant, but it's not the most awful thing that can happen? If we can truly get behind that and believe that, that can help bring the fear down as well. So again, it's looking at, what do we have? We have our physical health. Great. You could even, there are some OCD sufferers who have OCD and are battling cancer, so to see that, okay, well, again, it's a matter of gratitude, isn't it? It's, looking at the things we do have. When my OCD was at its worst, I had a roof over my head. I had a job. I had food on my plate. Don't get me wrong. I struggled to eat that food at the time because my appetite was so poor, but I had these things, and those are the things that you need. We need a degree of warmth, we need water, we need food to stay alive. We've got those things, we've got the things that we need. To rid ourselves of OCD then is not a need, it becomes a preference. So we've got the things we need, getting better from OCD becomes a preference. So it's gratitude for having the things we need, and seeing clearly that wanting to get better from OCD and get recovery right is a preference. It's not a need. Because we can still survive with OCD. Many of us have been able to go to work, earn a living, have children, go about their lives with OCD. And that doesn't mean that you don't want to get better. Of course you do, because it is hard, but you can still do life while struggling with OCD, whilst working on your recovery. So it's truly seeing these things, seeing it really, and that can allow you, once you truly believe that, we're changing the belief from having OCD is completely awful, you can't stand it, to having OCD is really hard, and I strongly prefer to be able to get recovery right and live a better quality of life. Once you truly believe the new rational belief, then you can start to bring the fear down and bring the anxiety down over not getting recovery right. You can start to better accept the uncertainty. So maybe I'm not doing this exposure perfectly, but I'm still going to do it. You can do that better and, drop the excessive note taking, and, maybe I'll leave my disputing to half an hour a day. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe it is. you can accept those uncertainties better when you've truly changed your perspective about having OCD and seeing that it is tolerable, you know, having these symptoms. They're really hard and unpleasant, but they are tolerable. You know, I strongly prefer to get recovery right and to get better, but I don't need it. It's not a desperate need. The whole world won't implode if I'm not doing recovery right now. The last kind of tip, I suppose, that I wanted to mention was self-compassion. So we've got a couple of videos about self-compassion on this channel. I think somebody's done one recently, but self-compassion is a big thing. It's not holding these godly demands over yourself. I must get recovery right. I should be able to do this. I'm completely stupid if I can't understand it and can't get recovery right. You know, again, here, if you step back and look at it realistically, how are you supposed to know for definite how to do it all correctly? You know, this is, firstly, no two people suffering from OCD are exactly the same. So it's a big learning curve, recovery. It's learning what you need to do. You know, sometimes, you know, there are certain points in your recovery journey, you need to put your foot on the gas and take it off the gas, as Rob has spoken about in other videos. And all of this stuff you learn as you go along, and you learn what works for you as well. You will find yourself making mistakes on your recovery journey. You might find yourself forcing acceptance and things. But why shouldn't you make mistakes on your recovery journey? It doesn't mean it can't be corrected and you can't sort of turn it back around again. But it's all learning. And how are you supposed to, just because you've read a couple of books about OCD and done some research, in some of our cases, probably a lot of us, okay, even if you've read 20 books about OCD, you're still not necessarily going to get recovery 100% right. And why the hell should you? Why the hell must you? You're not stupid because you find it difficult to understand. It can be difficult to understand the mechanics of it. You know, otherwise it wouldn't be the condition that it is. It wouldn't be getting us stuck in quite the same way if it wasn't quite so sly. So it's also allowing yourself to, you know, accepting that, yeah, you might get some of it wrong sometimes, but that doesn't completely write off your chance at recovery just because you get some of it wrong from time to time. It isn't easy. It is difficult. And we're allowed to not do it perfectly because we're imperfect human beings. We're fallible. And that is another big part of recovery is you know, that you don't have to do it perfectly. Why must you? Why should you? It's completely unrealistic. It's making godly demands of yourself. And again, it's only going to be adding. If you hold on to those kind of beliefs that you should be getting it right, then it's not going to be helpful for you. So I would really encourage a bit more flexibility in that area and kindness to yourself as well. So I hope this video has been helpful in terms of discussing how it can look when you're fearful of getting recovery wrong. So what those compulsions might look like, and then giving some kind of tips in terms of trying to be more rational about having OCD generally and how that can help. So like I said, our perspective on having OCD and gratitude's a big part of it. And as I've just discussed now, self-compassion is a big part of it as well. So I hope it has been helpful, and do take care. Bye.